For my very professional introduction, this is the history of the class. So Dalton left some open. You guys have met him before. He wanted to say, hello, everyone. He is an organizer with the Louisville Brigade. And he wanted to just thank you guys for coming. With that said, you guys most likely know that for the last few years, we've been seeing pretty particular oppression of working people, especially under Trump, even long before that, which is pretty explained in there. But we know for certain that there are marginalized communities fiercely attacked by the state. We know that there is ideology spreading that is telling people this group, that group's the problem, or stuff like that. So there we go. Union power in particular is pretty challenging. I mean, we see a lot of unions fall into being class collaborationists, which is that they're basically teaming up with business owners. They're teaming up with the capital state form of the US government. They are creating needless bureaucracy. They're pretty much becoming disconnected from the actual interests of the working class. And when it comes to actually challenging the suppression that we face, we see that we're taught in school that there's essentially ready-made, pre-packaged machinery. You know, if we want to challenge our exploitation, our oppression, we must go through the law, or we must lawsuit, or even worse, we must ask the boss, because clearly he has our interest in mind. If I just ask my boss, can I get a better pay? He'll do it, obviously. Last time I asked that, I got fired. But anyways, so clear from all this, working people are tired, they're angry, they don't know what to do. And I'm not saying that as a point of we know what to do. It's even sometimes I don't know what to do. I mean, if I'm working and I know that I need more money or I might not make next month's rent, what am I going to do? I can't do anything really. And without an alternative to this type of society where I can't do anything but sell all of my labor power or face starvation, there's not much in my handbook. I mean, I could join a big political party who will tell me, well, if we just do it our way, it might work. Our way may be the exact same way as we're doing it now, but with some smaller changes. But trust me, just trust me. So, what are we to do? Why is our society like this? Why do so many people suffer and a few thrive, living in mansions and driving in Mercedes cars that are more expensive than my own house? Why does everything appear to just stay the same or get worse? To answer this question, I have a meme. We live in a society. To actually answer the question, we must look at working people not as individuals. We must look at them as a group of people, because in a society, we are connected. I mean, to give you a short example, if I want one of those plastic things with the pears in them, well, those pears are plucked in Thailand, packaged over in China, trafficked to the United States, and all that labor got me connected to that first laborer. But I don't know who made those pears. I don't know who shipped them. There is a group that does not know they're a group. That group is class. And that's how we know we're the working class. It is determined by our relationship to the means of production. So a means of production is anything I can put my labor to that produces something. That could be a means of survival. I produce food in the form of farming. I could be in our society, production of commodities. I go to work, I go to my fast food joint, and I make burgers. Well, how does class affect society? Because we don't really know what makes us a class, although Well, we can't see it directly. I can't look at him and say he's a working class person. I can't look at you and say you're working class because there's no like big sign that says I'm working class. But we can see its outcomes as a group. Class divides people between this group of interests and that group of interests. Remember what I said earlier, that working people have an interest to better wages and better living conditions. Well, the owning class, the people who own the means of production, well, they have a different interest. They have an interest to make profit. Why else would you start a business if you don't need profit? These interests clash and create what is called the class struggle. There have been many different classes in history with different interests, and each of these classes are tied to a specific economic order or a mode of production. These classes have having these within these specific economic order struggle based on these interests. And that's what's really important as we go through today, the history of different class societies and the different class struggles that have existed. And they all tie in to where we are now, because the history of all existing society, all written society, is the history of class struggle. There has never been written, organized human society that has not experienced the class struggle. Primitive society, we saw very communal living. There was no class, no property. People kind of hunted and gathered and produced what they could to survive because they had very limited productive capacities. Pretty much lived how the natural world led them to live. But humans had something interesting. We're social. We organize together to say, hey, this person needs to produce this thing. That person needs to produce that thing. That as a group, we can survive. As that started to develop, that labor became, what's the word? It became basically split. These persons can say where that labor goes, and that person has to accept it. Because we get to classical society, also known as slave society. So there's two main classes that arose. One is the slave owning, and one is the slaves themselves. The slave owning class, of course, owned individuals as property. And why did they do this, though? Because they owned their productive capacity. And anything that they produced was their property. So, give me a second to think. The slave owning class, or the slave owned class, no, the slave themselves as a class. That's what I mean. Okay? Well, they had no other way of living. They were forced by their existing social structures to be enslaved. Now, during this stage of society, the slaves were generally fed and housed, and that was what differentiated from the next stage of society. During this society grew a certain interesting class. In Roman times, these were called the plebeians. Oh, and also to give you an example of where we are in history, this is during like Rome, Greece, and this kind of society has remnants that extends all the way, of course, to the southern U.S., which kept slave production, form of chattel slavery, all the way until like the 1800s, and even past that, because abolition of slavery didn't even abolish slavery. There was still slave modes of production within these other dominant modes. But we'll see how that works in terms of new class societies forming out of the old ones. And one interesting class that did arise during was the plebeians. So in Rome, there were a group of individuals that were either gifted land or bought land themselves. These were typically military members who were promised plots of land. And they had no ties. So that's the other interesting thing, is ties. We're going to get through ties to land as we go through feudalism, which is the next. But what slave owning did to justify and basically enforce that society was they created the slave state. So these were, a very big example would be Sparta. They would create these huge military states, conquer and enforce that these are their slaves and look for other people to enslave. And as more and more classes grew, and especially the plebeians who did not generally own slaves. Well, slaves did not want to be slaves. Who would? They wanted to free themselves from the shackles of slavery. And to do this, we can go to the feudal mode of production. Plebeians became the nobility. They said, we're tired of this slave-owning society. So did the slaves. So they teamed up, had revolutions. And in these revolutions, they destroyed everything. They destroyed all of the state machinery. They destroyed all of the former way organizing around the production. And they said, we're going to create it based on this system. We're going to create the nobles and the kings at the top. They owned everything, the land, land-wise. And they would create these large estates that the peasantry or the serfs worked on. So who are the serfs? When the slaves freed themselves from the shackles of slavery, they brought themselves into this new society. And with it, they were free men, except their land. They did not own the land they worked on. And the serfs in particular were generally tied to the land. The nobility created the new feudalist state in which they enforced that if you were born in this family, you work on this land, or we will kill you, or we will tax your family. And so they may not have been slaves, but they were essentially enslaved by society. Ownership of the land and the size of the land correlated with the class. And this society was extremely hierarchical. You could not move class at all. And that's how it basically enforced its society. Well, as we move on through medieval Europe, Imperial China, Meiji Japan, we start to see a new interesting class. Some people who are not really nobles, but not serfs either. They were artists and craftsmen who would not produce for the nobles, because remember, for this, we don't have commodities. So the peasantry and the serfs would produce so that the nobles could eat, and so that they could eat as well. They would produce their homes, and they would produce their communal land and cities. Well, there's a new group of people who were saying, hey, we're going to produce so that we can exchange it and get more commodities. But we don't want to produce it ourselves. We want to hire someone else to produce it. Doesn't matter who that is, as long as they're producing commodities, we're going to pay them to do that with what wealth we have. And a new class was rising within the society. This is what we call the bourgeoisie, or the owning class. And the owning class grew and grew and said, hey, we need a new system. Not a system based on enforcing the serf's existence and enforcing the power of the nobility, but a system that helps us produce commodities and expand production on an industrial level. So we get to the Industrial Revolution and the development of the capitalist mode of production. So who do the capitalists hire? Well, their whole job is to create a business and make profit. They're going to hire the cheapest labor they can find. That is the proletariat, or the working class. The working class has nothing but their own capacity to produce, to survive. And so the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, will look for anyone, anything, and expand their ownership of the means of production. They would purchase from any nobles who were necessary to find money. They would purchase and purchase and purchase, and then own and own and own. Use those laborers to get more and more money, and in particular, produce more commodities and expand capital. So capital is money that is reintroduced into the economy to expand. And this is where it gets a little weird, because capital itself is just an accumulation of those workers' labor. And who owns it? Bourgeoisie, capitalist class. Born out of feudalism. Was dominated by the production of. And this is where we get to French Revolution and a lot of revolutions, English Revolution, the American Revolution. We see the overthrow of nobles and the overthrow of kings. And we're going to make this new free society. Free for people who own the means of production. Remember, when America was first founded, only white landowners could even participate in politics, could essentially be free people. And we see this even to this day, where you're essentially tied to how much you own, or you're a working class and you may even just be poor. So there's these new mechanisms of making for profit, and they're now dispelling the kings and dispelling the nobility. They're destroying all feudal means and all feudal states, and they're completely wiping it and replacing it with new capitalist society. Everything around us today was either destroyed and replaced or destroyed and repurposed for the benefit of creating an entire society based on producing commodities and gaining money, gaining, spending capital. And unlike previous systems, this exploitation is hidden. We see elections and democracy, so-called, but who pays millions of dollars to the states? Who even created the state? The proletariat working class. They didn't create the state. It was the capitalist class. The land-owning people who are only the ones only allowed to participate in politics. And this was common across any capitalist revolution that has happened. In the French Revolution, we saw Napoleon, who dominated Europe. You think a working classman even got the chance to be in the government? Only like a few examples. Even then, they didn't have near as much power as the land. In America, we saw all of our presidents essentially were landowners or former colonialists. George Washington himself he owned slaves. He owned means of production, expanded his own wealth and capital. So this gets to our class struggle. Where does the working class fit within these classes? Working class obviously does not like this. I don't like this. And we have an interest to not be forced into a society where we make too low wages to even survive, or work in factories where our fingers may be cut off, or at worst, in the earliest forms of capitalism, we had little child slaves. We even kept slavery around in the 1800s. So people gathered together around France, working people. They called it the International Workingmen's Association, which we kind of consider the first international, but there's like a bunch of weird documents. But most of these were centered in the Industrial Revolution, where proletariat working people were forced into factories. They had nothing else to do. They would die if they did not work and work and work. We had children who would be paid pennies. Their parents were forced to send them to work, or they would starve and die. They lived in these rancid buildings where they had to pay most of what they earned to that landowner in the first place. And so many different people and ideologies grouped together with the common cause of, hey, we're working people. We need to do something about this. So big key figures that came out of the First International were Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. We saw Bukharin and Prometeo. Paris Commune shortly later was formed. So Franco-Prussian War essentially was France bourgeoisie were wanting stuff from German capitalists, or German Prussian capitalists. German Prussian capitalists wanted stuff from France, so they warred. They said, what pieces of land and production, and more specifically, what resources and working class people can we exploit and get the benefit of? We'll see this expand into global imperialism later. But for now, the important thing is Paris had a lot of working people who did not like this. When Germany won the war, they went into Paris, they pillaged, they raped, they killed anyone that opposed this new order. And so for the first time in our history, working people said, we're having enough. We're going to create what is officially called the dictatorship of the proletariat, but for word's sake, we're just going to say proletariat working class state. So they expelled all of the capitalists, and they said, this is the working class city now. We're going to organize our own state and lead towards a revolution. So the biggest error with the Paris Commune was that they did not organize enough. In particular, I don't remember here. Paris Commune and specifically did not learn how to create an invariant doctrine. They didn't say, "Hey, we're all for this new society." They were like, "What is this new society we want?" And so, questioning too much, they really did not expand outside of Paris and eventually failed. But what has been proven is that the working class can, in fact, form their own state aside from the capitalists. It is possible. And that inspired the Second International. So in 1889, we see famous people, Friedrich Engels again, we see Rosa Luxemburg, we see Bakunin again, I believe Kropotkin was in the Second International. We see Bernstein and Kautsky. Those are all historical figures, but the important part is that this was the first time people got together and say, hey, we actually need to know what we're fighting for, and we need to figure it out. So they developed this program in which we're going to fight for an international revolution of socialism in particular. We're going to organize to overthrow the capitalist class, create a system where we're not forced to spend all of our hours working and producing commodities for someone else's wealth, but producing for our own use, producing to survive with each other. Well, the biggest problem was that half of the group believed we can use the current state, and at this time would be like the German, French states, the Russian state. We can use this state to change things. Well, that proved wrong because when the other side said, no, we can't, they employed any means necessary. The original fascist organs actually came from around here because they enforced paramilitaries to destroy, kill anyone who did not agree with using the state as a means to create this new system. We saw the murder of Rosa Luxemburg at this point. She was killed and thrown into a river. So from this, we saw a bunch of like revolutions. There were pretty thoroughly communist revolutions and socialist revolutions. By this time, we're about to 1919, and that's where we get to the Third International. So it was established around like, and this was a new thing because they learned from this lesson and the lesson in the Paris Commune and the lesson of the First International that we have to have a doctrine that we all can agree on that is scientific and material, and we have to not use the capitalists' ready made state machinery to create this. So it was created essentially as a way of saying we're all going to be as one big organization to fight for this one goal that is international, that is beyond the scope of any particular race or nation or culture or language. So we had groups from France, Spain. You had groups from Russia. You had groups from the United States. All the way down, you had groups from Africa, Kazakhstan, Chinese groups, had Mexican groups, and they genuinely were fighting an international revolution. And at that point, the Soviet Union was made, and it gave people a glimpse into, hey, socialists can organize and successfully have a revolution. But here was the big issue, that they thought that they can still keep certain pieces of capitalism, or that Marx forgot to believe this, and there's a bunch of like debates. That goes into the fact they thought you can achieve socialism in one country, and that Russia alone could achieve socialism and then spread it to other countries as if they're the forebearers of communism. Turns out that's not true, because what happened was through the Soviet Union, we saw after Lenin's death, the rise of a new bureaucracy that acted as the capitalist class. And even worse, Joseph Stalin, who falsified and basically turned our movement into what we kind of know as communism now, which is more of like, we believe this basic things, but we still want most of capitalism in there, but don't worry about that. But this was the last international organization after that. I generally call it the Great Falsification. After that, most of those international country or those organizations adopted socialism in one country, and Joseph Stalin sliced Russia from the International Revolution, kind of died out, unfortunately. Capitalist states did not care or supported this falsification. I mean, we even saw the Soviet Union and the Nazis collaborate with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So right now we're at the stage where the main organs of proletariat organizing pretty shattered, but it is generally focused around protecting what we had, the Third International, and applying that to our current conditions as we move on. Big moments within this timeline. We saw the banana republics. The class struggle intensified within the Cold War, and that was between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, I want to clear this out of the way. This was not an ideological struggle like our schools. This wasn't capitalism versus communism. This was which capitalist faction can own more workers. And like it's pretty clear when we see like most of the revolutions were based on some national struggle, or even worse, not, and it was just purely capitalistic on behalf of the Soviet Union. But what is important is that there were a lot of organizing against imperialism. So by this time, capitalism has learned from our movements as a working class, and it has decided to develop itself into creating finance capital, where it could basically have these group of countries own this groups of countries' economy. And now it is solely based on the production of commodities. So it is important to know that this isn't like this country hates that country, so they're going to own it. Like it is purely, not purely because of ideology, but it is essentially the capitalist class of this country wants this country's production and resources. And so the banana republics, like I mentioned, was an intensification of this struggle. We saw companies control vast lands across South America. I mean, and Central America. There was even entire countries that were just, the president was, I think it was United Fruits Company, something like that. Like, I'm not even joking. They assassinated the leader for saying, I think it was Nicaragua. They assassinated the leader for saying, we want land to be owned by the people who work on it. And America was like, communist. So they sent a company leader over there to assassinate them alongside federal soldiers. The United States, the state, which remember, state is created by the capitalists. Well, they used that state, say these countries are evil, and we're going to go in and invade them. And they would invade those countries, and they would say, oh, we're going to make this new democracy for them in the form of farm owning class people. Like, they're people who owned all the farms and everything that was produced on it. It got so bad that there, let's see, yeah, it got so bad that like that's where we get the term banana republic from. Was there would be literal republics or countries that were solely a company's land. It was really insane. But that's an example of how far the capitalist class will go to own as much stuff as it can and accumulate more capital and commodities. And the working class, I mean, what are we to do? Well, that will get answered shortly. But for now, the point is, capitalist class will use violence. It will tear us apart because they are organized and they know what they want. They know they want profit. So we get to another example, which is the South Korean White Terror. So after the South Korea-North Korea War, South Korea government instituted a terror campaign against anyone who was perceived as a socialist. Any labor organizer was targeted. It was known as the Bodo League Massacre. The massacre was hidden for decades, and eventually, before even being acknowledged by the government, whose Truths and Reconciliations Commission, tasked with investigating this incident, noted that 100,000 people at least were killed just for possibly being socialist. Possibly. Not even, half of them weren't even socialists. A lot of them were just black or Chinese immigrants or Japanese immigrants. So we'll also see that organizing is a threat, because that shows that we're done being exploited. I don't know how to reword that, but essentially, arming ourselves is not a terrible idea, as long as we do want to work within the bounds of legality. That actually is a whole other debate on its own. But that's not because we want to work within the legal system. It's more of our job is to expose to other workers contradictions within capitalism and gain them towards the revolution. Remember, we will never be the one starting the revolution. It will always be the capitalists. We saw this with Russia, where they fiercely fired upon protesters, or essentially peaceful protesters. They would fire, jail, and exile labor organizers. We saw this in Germany with the pre-mentioned Second International, where anyone who opposed the state, they would come in and kill. We see this today. The migrant workers, the capitalist state, they see them protesting. They go in with police armed to the brim with guns and grenades and tanks. I know in San Diego, there was like an armed vehicle, like one of those armored cars going down the street. I'm just like, you see a protester throw a rock and they send that in. Like a good example of how, while we do want to work within the bounds of legality, it is not because we want to work within the legal system. We want to our job is to show other workers how to organizing for themselves and lead into the revolution. And that, yes, that revolution will likely be violent, but it is not us who wants violence. We want to survive. We just want to make a living. So important planning is also an important part of that. And as mentioned, international goals, and working beyond the scope of just individual groups. So here's some history within America. We have the National Labor Union, which formed in 1966, was one of the largest labor federations in the U.S., and its main aim was improving the lives of its members through lobbying Congress to pass pro-labor legislation. It did reformed into the short-lived Labor Reform Party in 1872. It would dissolve because what it took was a class collaboration's perspective. It did not take class perspective. It did not say this is what's happening with the classes. The working classes are being exploited by the owning classes. It kind of just had like, we're bad living, let's make it. That's not bad on its own. It did not yield any results. It represented a sign of growing worker organization. I'm sorry. The NOU did oppose strikes, and it represented a sign of growing worker organization against the owning class that would only escalate, however. The Knights of Labor were established in 1869 as a clandestine organization to protect its members from bosses. It was very secret, but it would be done away with in 1869. Unlike the future AFL, Knights of Labor represented skilled and unskilled workers, believing both had a shared interest in uniting against bosses. They did not look at it through the interest of class. They just wanted skilled and unskilled workers. They kind of looked at workers as just individual workers that were part of the organization and not workers as a group of people. So it was one of the largest organizations. It had like 700,000 members at its peak. It would not remain because of internal tensions, and I believe Knights of Labor were not accepting of Black workers, real workers. So from this, we saw the rise of the American Federation of Labor. In 1886, it became the successor to the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions in the United States and Canada. Unlike the Knights of Labor, it was very craft unionist, believing organizing workers on specific trades or crafts. So like they would create an all elevators worker union, all railroad industry. And that helped them early on as more skilled laborers thought to organize from the unskilled. But this was a more conservative approach because they did not want unskilled workers. It would be like organizing a labor federation right now and saying, you don't want McDonald's. They're not real workers. Us strong railroad workers. And unfortunately, they also were very class collaborationist, racist, sexist, generally more antagonistic to workers, other than contemporary modern labor union. So in contrast to the FL, the Industrial Workers of the World, established in 1905 in Chicago, sought to bring a revolutionary character to the working class struggle. We saw very famous labor organizers, some of them Marxists, Big Bill Haywood, William Z. Foster, Lee C. Parson, and among others. From its inception, the IWW challenged the status quo, called for radical revolutionary change in society, which was backed up by their inclusion of empowering its black and female membership, which was unheard of at the time, and especially in the labor movement. But the IWW espoused industrial unionism, which called for all workers in any industry, regardless of skill, to go into one big union, giving all workers more leverage in labor management. Fortunately, the successful revolutions in Europe, as well as several male bombings at the time, the FBI used this as a pretext to target the labor movement and farmer raids, claiming foreigners were bringing dangerous ideas into American soil. And these raids essentially destroyed the IWW. Another thing that led to the IWW's downfall is they did not have a common doctrine. They believed that they can change society purely on the basis of economics. We could create a union-based society, and that would be the forebearer of socialism. Well, a lot of Marxists, Daniel De Leon being an intro, said, hey, we have to focus also on the political side of this. There is the capitalist state, like the FBI, that will go in and destroy it. What do we do about that? We have to look at this through a scientific perspective. He unfortunately got kicked out. And a lot of anarchism, which is its own ideology that believes in the destruction of the state solely. Some believe in communism, but the main focus is that the state is the forebearer of power, not the capitalist class. And that expelled any Marxists, and eventually federal agents came in and destroyed it. The next big group is the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And in 1935, it was the successor to the Committee for Industrial Organization, which wanted the AFL to organize unskilled. This committee would split from the AFL after repeated infighting, and as it created the new labor federation under CIO, it represented an alternative to the craft unionist-dominated AFL. And it was especially good for black workers who were often regulated to unskilled labor. Black workers were also repulsed by rampant racism found in the AFL and decided to join the CIO. During its early history, the CIO would become welcome in labor radicals who would become an integral force inside of it, organizing millions of workers and creating some of the most radical unions in American history, such as the United Packing House Workers of America, United Electrical Railroad and Machine Workers of America, and United Farm Equipment Workers of America. But unfortunately, as time passed, the federal legislation became increasingly anti-union and targeted any semblance of labor radicalism. The CIO turned against the labor radicals and expelled them, and unfortunately ended up collaborating with the United States government, or capitalist state, to expel these revolutionaries. Gave it a capitalist nature to see it in the form of labor or yellow unions nowadays, united with the AFL alternatively, create the AFL-CIO. During the development of fascism in Europe, there was one key thing that differentiated fascism from any other capitalist, and that was it integrated unions into the state. Sounds weird. We usually think of fascism as, totalitarian, and that is its main point. However, really, it is that integration of unions that made it so different. Because now the capitalist state watched and controlled labor organizing. The class struggle was now under the capitalists' hand. And we see this today in the form of AFL-CIO. Organizers will try to create unions, and they will join the AFL-CIO. And there's other unions, federations that do this, but the big one is AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO will say, we will give you all these resources, all this stuff, and we will fight for this right if you do it our way. And their way, historically, is collaborating with the state. There's even instances where the AFL-CIO was employed by the government to quell labor movements in other countries. So as fascism developed, it became a tool within capitalism, not just a type of capitalism. Like there's liberal democracy, fascism, No, these are now two types, tools that the capitalist class can use. We see how we may, have democratic processes for electing the president, yet they also employ the state through the unions. That is fascistic. I mean, we even see it doing fascist things with ICE, immigration customs enforcement. Like that is if I'm anyone to say something's fascist, it would be raiding homes and taking people to deport them out of the country and taking all their stuff or putting them into essentially internment camps. I mean, we saw this with FDR. He would, if I recall, he would essentially take any unions and either destroy them or integrate them state to do the work of the capitalist lobbyists. Throughout World War One, we saw the internment, or I believe it was World War Two, the internment um, of Japanese people and really any Asian people into literal camps. Like it was essentially no different than Holocaust camp. It was really bad, starvation, deaths. Only difference was that they didn't do the enforcement of like custom killings, but with an asterisk because they kind of did, but that's its own story. So we have here a bunch of lessons now that we've learned through the history of ourselves as a class, and really class as a whole. We saw the development of the division of labor that led to classes, groups of people that had their own interests. We saw feudalism organize people into strict hierarchies. But what makes capitalism particularly interesting is that it was organized not based on producing for people to use things, but producing solely for exchange and accumulating money. And that is where the working class today stands. We are on the brink of history. Not the end, because history does not end. We are on the brink of history of the class struggle. Because from now on, we have to ask the question, is this within our interests as a working class? Is a state that will employ violence, that will support anyone who threatens the country or the state that was built off of genocide, off of enslavement, and not just our state, but everywhere in the world. Because that's another thing that makes it different, is that capitalism globalized and it forced workers to rely on each other internationally. There is no nation that does not have the labor of another nation in its products that it consumes. If I'm in Russia and I eat an apple that was plucked in Kazakhstan, if I'm in Germany, I'm eating a sandwich, one of those packaged ones at the stuff you get at the gas stations, probably made in Britain. I go to the local gas station over here. I get a packaged egg. Well, that plastic was built or was formed in some other country. Workers are united internationally, but their labor is so alienated that we don't even know who made it. And that brings us to where we go. Where do we go now? The important thing now on is to know that we need to organize not just within our own personal interests, but our interests as a class which we have established as international, that is beyond race or gender or class. And we need to, big important thing is if we do unionize, which we should, we need to be class. We need to ask the question constantly, how does this serve our interests how does this serve it as a means of survival collectively? And that is unfortunately where a lot of unions as it was established fell, was people didn't ask that question. They asked, how does this serve me? Or how does this serve my local group's interest? By recognizing that there is an international class of working people who all of which are exploited and oppressed, killed, for even talking about the capitalist. By recognizing that alone, we can make the questions more clear. We can now ask, what do we do here, knowing that we're an international? Well, that is where we brigade and other organizers as well stand. And we say we want a revolution We want a revolution that changes society from the ground up and forming a new society that's not based on the production of exchange, on the production of money, things that cost money for some small group of people to own, but for the production, things that we can sustain ourselves living. That probably didn't make sense. For the production of things from which we can live off of. Producing food for each other to eat, not producing food so that a small group of people can own that food. That is where we get to today. That is the history. Past. I need your.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And thanks for everybody for attending this educational presentation organized by the Louisville Workers Brigade. I'm Vince. I'm a local activist, abolitionist, and a revolutionary. I'd like to first say, please bear with me. These are not my notes, so I'm just going to read them verbatim. Brigade is an association of working people founded upon the principles of class struggle and committed to supporting and fighting for the interests of all working and oppressed people in the Louisville community, with this accomplished by educating, supporting, and uniting working people toward building a militant labor movement. We strive to educate working and oppressed people on labor and working class history, concepts, and issues to build class consciousness that undergirds class struggle. We strive to support working and oppressed people in any way we can to build solidarity, demonstrate the power that collective actions result in making the working class's struggle for an interest possible. We strive to unite working and oppressed people of all stripes, identities, and backgrounds based on their shared class interests, cutting through the social divisions the owning class inflames so that our engagement in class struggle and the labor movement is built on solid basis of solidarity of all forms, interracial, intergenerational, interindustrial, etc. In everything we do, the brigade is dedicated to fighting for working and oppressed people's interests in opposition to the owning class, the class that exploits and oppresses us all, and extracts more wealth and power off the labor of working and oppressed people abroad. Under this system, there can be no peaceful coexistence. Only a militant class struggle that ends in the liberation of all working people and oppressed people of all backgrounds and identities. And as we begin to wrap up, I want to let everyone know that the brigade is already planning for our next educational for June. Information about that will be announced on our social media, so please follow the brigade on our Instagram and Facebook to stay up to date on this event as well as all events and actions we organize. Which I'd also like to invite you all out on July 5th. We're going to be over at the park, the Iroquois Park. We're just going to hang out, just a cool down off of July 4th celebration. I know a lot of folks would like to celebrate what's going on right now, but most of us that are politically mindful are going to want to just kind of cool off and like blow off some steam. That's what we're going to do. Just going to chill. And once again, we'll thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. Power, liberation, and peace to working and oppressed people. All right. Good job.